February 1st, 1943. North Africa. High above the pale brown earth of Tunisia, the winter sky was hard and bright, almost metallic, and the air around the bomber stream trembled with the layered thunder of engines. In the nose of a Boeing B-17F flying fortress named All-American, frost edged the framing. Oxygen lines hissed softly, and the deep synchronized beat of 4 Wright cyclones carried through the fuselage like the pulse of an iron cathedral. Below, Tunis lay under war, its docks a vital artery for German and Italian armies fighting in Tunisia. Ahead was target, flak, and fighters. Behind was Biskra Airfield in Algeria, nearly 300 miles away. At that altitude, men learned quickly that distance was not measured in miles alone. It was measured in fire, in control, and in whether aluminum and nerve could outlast physics. The mission mattered because Tunisia, in early 1943, was not a side theater. It was the hinge of the North African campaign. The Axis still depended on ports, transport lines, and shipping networks to sustain their armies. American heavy bombers of the 12th Air Force were striking those links in order to starve the enemy of movement and momentum. The aircraft that morning, serial number 41-24406, belonged to the 414th Bombardment Squadron of the 97th Bombardment Group. Under Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, Jr., All-American was one machine among many, but it represented something larger than itself: the expanding reach of American industry, crew training, and strategic air power. The B-17F was built for endurance, 74 feet long, with a wingspan of more than 103 feet, armed with multiple .50 caliber machine guns powered by 4 supercharged radial engines, and designed around the doctrine that a heavy bomber could absorb punishment and keep going. On paper, that idea was persuasive. Over Tunis, it was about to be tested beyond anything its designers likely imagined. What many of those Americans expected was a short war of bright banners and decisive gestures, a campaign against a decaying empire that would collapse once struck. Some imagined sabers, bugles, and the old heroic geometry of battle, the clean uphill rush, the neat victory, the triumphant photograph afterward. Roosevelt himself was a student of valor and action, and much of the national imagination around the war was built from that same hunger for proof that the American Republic was vigorous, masculine, united, and destined for greater things. But Cuba did not offer pageantry. It offered heat, insects, bad roads, fouled water, confusion in command, and an enemy using modern smokeless Mauser rifles from fortified positions that were hard to see and easy to die beneath. The advance inland after the landings at WWII and Siboney in late June had already shown this. At Las Guasimas on June 24th, the Rough Riders had their first fight, and 7 of them died, with 34 wounded. The lesson was immediate. Spanish troops might be fewer in number, but from cover and elevation they could punish any exposed advance. A volunteer with patriotic certainty could be killed as quickly as any regular. The tin cup of coffee still passed from hand to hand in camp, but now it was held by men who had heard bullets snap through brush and knew that enthusiasm did not stop a rifle round. The force assembling before Santiago was larger than legend usually remembers, and more complicated than the old paintings suggest. Major General William Shafter planned to seize the city by taking its outer defenses. The 2nd Division would attack El Caney to the northeast and then join the main assault on the San Juan Heights. The 1st Division and the dismounted cavalry division would strike the ridgeline itself. On paper, it looked coordinated. On the ground, it unraveled. El Caney, expected to fall quickly, became an all-day fight. Narrow jungle roads jammed with men, units bunched together under fire. Artillery opened and ceased. The Americans moving toward San Juan found themselves delayed, compressed, and increasingly exposed. The Spanish defenders, estimated at roughly 4,500 on the heights, had trenches, blockhouses, cannon, and wire. The attacking American force, reinforced by Cuban allies and numbering roughly 7,000 to 8,000, possessed great energy, but not great elegance. What emerged from the grass that day was not a choreographed assault, but a dangerous accumulation of men under orders that came late, changed shape, or never came clearly at all. The battle most Americans remember as one glorious charge was in truth an afternoon of stalled movement, mounting casualties, and tactical improvisation under terrible fire. That image transformed more than the reputation of one bomber. It altered how men understood the flying fortress itself. Photographs of All-American circulated because they offered visual proof of a claim that otherwise sounded like invention. The airplane looked impossible. Yet it was real, and it reinforced the growing wartime mythology of the B-17 as a machine able to bring crews home from damage that should have been terminal. At the same time, the real history is more disciplined than the legend. The aircraft was not some ghost flying without a tail at all. It was an aircraft grievously damaged but still partially intact, held in the air by rugged construction, crew competence, and exceptional fortune. That distinction matters because it honors the truth rather than weakening it with exaggeration. The truth is already extraordinary enough. The official record shows that, after repair, All-American returned to service, was reassigned to the 301st Bomb Group, and flew on until near the end of the war before being salvaged in Italy on March 6, 1945. This was no single-use miracle. It was a war machine restored, reused, and sent forward again. There is another transformation in the story, quieter but just as significant. For the Germans defending Tunis, American bombers were targets to be driven off or destroyed. Yet incidents like this revealed a harder truth about the enemy they were fighting. America was not merely sending aircraft. It was sending systems, crews trained to stay calm, formations willing to protect the damaged, factories able to replace losses, maintenance units able to repair the unthinkable, and designers who had built redundancy into the machine itself. The four-engine thunder returning over Biskra was therefore more than survival. It was a warning about scale. A fighter could slash one bomber nearly in half. It could not so easily slash apart the industrial civilization that had produced that bomber, filled it with fuel and guns, trained its crew, supported its repair, and sent it back into combat. In that sense, the sound over Algeria was the sound of American abundance translated into war. Not luxurious abundance, but productive abundance, organized abundance, the abundance of spare capacity that authoritarian systems often underestimate until it is too late. For the crew, ideology would have meant less in the moment than touch and sound. Frost on framing, metal under gloves, the resistance of the yoke, the ceaseless vibration through the deck. Yet history permits a wider view. These airmen were serving not a perfect nation, but a constitutional republic whose strength in war increasingly came from distributed effort. Workers, mechanics, engineers, logisticians, and crews, each part depending on the others. In that way, the B-17 itself becomes a fitting symbol of democracy at war. No single engine carried it home. No single gun defined it. No single man could save it alone. It remained aloft because multiple parts, damaged though they were, still functioned together. The deep rhythm of four cyclones was therefore more than a sound effect in the sky. It was a kind of civic metaphor, heavy and mechanical, separate cylinders firing in sequence, distinct efforts joined into one forward motion. The bomber flew home not because it was unbreakable, but because enough of it still worked together. That is a useful definition not only of aircraft, but of free societies under strain. And so the story endures, because it lives at the border between engineering and faith. The engineers gave the bomber strength, the factories gave it form, the crew gave it steadiness, and fortune allowed all those things to hold for one more hour and a half over North Africa. Long after the smoke of Tunisia passed into history, the photograph remained. A B-17 torn open in the tail, flying anyway. It is easy to treat such images as miracles detached from context. But the real power of this one lies in context. It was born of a campaign to choke Axis supply, flown by the 97th Bomb Group, commanded by Lieutenant Bragg, nearly destroyed by a Bf-109G, carried home to Biskra, repaired, returned to service, and finally scrapped only in 1945 after years more of war. It was not a myth that briefly visited history. It was history, and history was enough. In the end, perhaps the most haunting part of the tale is not the collision, nor even the landing, but the sound that survived them both. 4 engines over desert sky. 4 engines carrying wounded metal and living men back across nearly 300 miles of war. 4 engines sounding like the material confidence of a nation that believed broken things could be repaired and sent back into the struggle. The dictatorships of the age promised invincibility. This bomber revealed something more durable than that. It revealed resilience.